Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us for worship today. This morning, I want to talk about the gift of community, gift of relationship, and then also lean into a ministry opportunity around a new technology called generative AI. So that's kind of the second half. So this morning, I want to talk about our gospel lesson first. It's the account of Andrew and Peter's call to follow Jesus as it's told in John's gospel. It's different from the version that we hear in the synoptic gospels where they're both fishing, Jesus walks along, says follow, and boom, it's off. There's more to the story here, and perhaps it's a little bit more understandable. In John's gospel, we learn that Andrew is in fact a disciple of John the Baptist. He's been with them, probably discerning where and who this Messiah might be. And as he is searching and seeking, not blindly, but seeking because through John he learns that the Messiah is here. And when John points out Jesus, Andrew and another of John's disciples follow Jesus and they spend the day with him. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, John is clear about the time. At 4 in the afternoon, Andrew leaves and finds his brother Peter and says, "We have found the Messiah." And he brings Peter to Jesus, and Jesus says to him, "Simon, son of John, you're to be called Cephas," or Peter, or rock. Now, what moves me about this encounter is that Andrew wasn't just told that Jesus was the Messiah. He spent the day with him. He had this encounter with Jesus. And the text tells us this. It identifies the specific time when Andrew had this encounter. And the text said it was 4 in the afternoon. And you probably know for yourself when you've had a life-changing event, you know the time and the place where you had that, right? It's rare that we actually hear a time of day in the Gospels. But at 4 in the afternoon, just to be clear, 4 in the afternoon, Andrew has this profound experience and runs and finds his brother Peter. Unlike in John the Baptist's teaching, which he had been listening to, something here was different. Something that confirmed internally the hope that he and his entire religious tradition had had about the arrival of the Messiah. For Andrew, he felt reconnected with God through Jesus in a way that brought wholeness and restoration and unity with God. That through Jesus, there was a return to that original state of spiritual grace written in that ancient story of the Garden of Eden. You could describe it as a buoyancy of relationship. Andrew felt lifted up above life's tumultuous problems and experiences and events, lifted up into this unity where he and God were now one because of Jesus. It wasn't his wisdom or commitment to social justice. God and Jesus brought to completion a disconnection that Andrew was experiencing. "We have found the Messiah," he says to Peter. And Peter could feel it in Andrew when he said these words. It is this buoyancy of relationship that we experience for ourselves as we are in certain places like taking communion, or in a quiet place of prayer, or reading a piece of scripture that feels as if it was written just for you, or in serving another person in a way that you know that you are in the exact right place at the right time for healing to take place. We have been brought and lifted up through God's love for us. It is this unity or oneness that has been in the heart of our desire of our faith tradition. So quite often we see this buoyancy of relationship, this lifted up, this kind of connection point, mirrored quite often in our relationships. And children are really good at showing us the purity of relationships. I recall a time about 5 years ago when we were working with my daughter Olivia about being okay at being dropped off at preschool. You may know this moment in your own family life. You know you have friends around you. It's going to be well. It's going to be fine. And during one of those moments, I had stayed a little bit longer just to peek around the corner and see what was happening when I left her. But something happened in her class. These little 3 and 4-year-olds gathered around Olivia because she was so upset, and they each, at their own initiative, gave her a hug. And then she was fine. They knew she was sad, and that connection or relationship was what would make her feel better. You see, Olivia's sadness was a community issue, and together they solved it through their relationship. Their love for Olivia lifted her up, and she realized that she was not alone. I wonder on the eve of Martin Luther King Jr. Day if this is not a great model for the church in terms of racial healing. You know, that a person's experience is actually a community issue, and together we work to resolve it. Our prayer book says that the mission of the church is to restore unity with God and people with one another. It is a buoyancy of relationship, that we are to bring people into the mindset of connection rather than isolation, just as Andrew did for Peter, showing him this magnificent way in which he feels this restoration, this unity, this buoyancy of relationship. We find it in the vision of our church. We state for ourselves here at Good Shepherd that in the fullness of time, all people are brought together in joyful union with God and one another, being fully known and fully loved. It's a blessing that we all share, and it's a blessing that we offer to others. If you've been paying attention to the news cycle in the last 2 weeks, you have noticed the excitement around a particular topic called generative AI. And according to one definition, generative AI is a type of artificial intelligence that involves creating new, original content or data using machine learning algorithms. And it can be used to generate texts, images, music, or other type of media. And there's been all sorts of feelings expressed by that. Suspicion, fear, excitement, hesitation. And as you can imagine, this generative AI has gotten the attention of schools, right? As I was listening to this technology being explained, the speaker was talking about, as he was using this app, that generative AI can be used to write a short story just at the drop of a hat. So he took it to the test. He's like, I'm going to ask it to write a short love story. 2 seconds later, there it was. And then he said, I'm going to ask it to rewrite the first paragraph in a Shakespearean dialect. Seconds later, there it was, complete with rhyming. And then he said, well, what if we were to write it in the voice of a 1940s mobster and it's raining outside? And there it was, seconds later. So you can see why this might have an impact on term papers, right? Speeches, why schools are suddenly a little bit concerned about where all this is going and may need to rethink how to test competency and knowledge. That, you remember that old handwritten in-class exam blue book, do you remember this? Might just be coming back. But it goes a step further. There's been a large use of generative AI to answer mental health issues and questions. In other words, people are using it for therapy. And given the loneliness that exists in our culture and has been on the rise for the last 2 decades, one can see the temptation to ask a computer questions about relationship and mental health rather than sitting in the presence of a loving human being. But here's why I raised our attention this morning around generative AI. While there might be a shift in our own dependency and use of computers to help always drive more efficiency, right? My concern is that this temptation to make our lives more efficient, specifically in this case, will lead to a diminishment of our humanity and our sense of connection to one another. No longer do we have to do the hard work of creating original material or content and develop a voice around how we might write a short story or a poem, or even describe and do the hard work of what am I standing for? How to articulate that purpose. If I have to write a best man speech for my brother's wedding, boom, there it is. If I have to write a note to my wife about how much I care for her, there it is. Without doing any creative hard labor, we further feel disconnected from life and from that original, creative human experience. And I know from being a pastor for so many years that the effect of disconnection increases our experience of fear and anxiety. That the normal human response to connection and loneliness are fear and anxiety. So while we like efficiency that sometimes things like generative AI might bring, I feel like it will diminish the sense of humanity, being created in God's image of relationship and our connection to the experience of life itself. The bottom line is love isn't efficient. It requires our time, our engagement, and attention. So you may ask yourself, why is Channing talking so long about generative AI in church? Because I believe there's a real ministry opportunity for the church to play. Like in my daughter's preschool class, we identify that individual problems are community issues, and we offer connection, buoyancy of relationship. That when the world experiences further disconnection, we also must increase our ministry of connection. That our bread and butter is relationship and connection that we hear about in our lessons for today. Isaiah describes how God knew Isaiah in the womb. Paul talks about the fruit of the fellowship of the church as being the blessing of grace, spiritual gifts, and strength to persevere. In our gospel lesson, Andrew, after years of searching, experienced this one person to restore him to God. It was a blessing of oneness and a return to that original state of spiritual grace. As Christians, we are called to love God with all of our heart, soul, and mind, and to love our neighbor as Christ loved us. This is where we thrive. So as this connection increases, our ministry to create connection for others will also need to increase. It will be to discover the blessing of love, the experience of it deep within ourselves, and do the hard work of healing broken places by investing ourselves in the lives of others, not by posing a question to an online bot. Renee Miller, in his book, Fertile Soil on a Barren Land, tells this story about disconnection. He writes, the story is, "When will God speak to me and tell me what to do, Rabbi?" this young man asks. "Our God, blessed be He, is always speaking to you if you have ears to hear, replied the rabbi. "But I never hear His voice, teacher," he said quietly. "Yahweh spoke you into being as Yahweh spoke creation into being, as Yahweh spoke covenant to Abraham, as Yahweh spoke our fathers and mothers through the wilderness," the rabbi answered. "But why can't I hear?" he almost whispered. When your heart becomes as quiet as your whispered question, you will hear the still small voice of God. Blessed be God. Like this wisdom story, it begins with encounter. This pure, peaceful, life-giving connection with God is the life we know and the life we have to offer. In a world that seems to be moving away from relationship and toward quick answers that lack connection, our gift is to offer and develop a palpable depth, to know the experience of our hearts dwelling in the love of God. So I want to encourage us to prepare for this ministry and to have some homework to take home with you this afternoon. And that is to find a moment throughout this week to create space for stillness and peace. Start with your breath and get quiet. Read a verse from the Psalms or the Gospels that inspires you, and let it lead you into God's presence. And remain in that place of peace for some time, and to know deep within you the blessing of that connection. If we are to share Christ with another, it is important that we have spent time with Him ourselves. Thank you for your part and reconnecting others with the blessing of relationship with God in love. Amen.